Hello, everyone, and welcome to Four Mothers of the Women's Spirituality online resource. I'm your hostess, Vajra, and I'm the curator of the project, and we're here today with Max Dashu. Hello, Max. Welcome.
Hi, Vajra.
Great to have you here. Max, what I'm going to do first is read an introduction that sets our interview into a context, and then I'll read your bio, and then we'll get started. Women's spirituality emerged as a major component of what's known today as the second wave of women's liberation. The women's liberation movement started in the 60s and went through the 70s. Women's spirituality picked up in the 70s and the 80s. But many people today do not know about these courageous and radical, and by radical I mean to the root, foremothers of women's spirituality. These women who developed authentic spiritual experiences and practices beyond the boundaries of patriarchal religions. These feminists followed their conviction, their passion, their inner knowing, and they built upon a growing scholarly historical body of knowledge. And some brought through intact wisdom traditions from indigenous cultures to point us back to the nature and female honoring spirituality that preceded the past 6,000 to 10,000 years of the father gods, patriarchal father gods. These four mothers, along with many other feminists, pioneered a diverse spiritual orientation based in respect, reverence, and relationship with all. The four mothers of that emergence are not only historically significant, but they're significant because many today are still continuing their vital work, and that's why we've created the Online Resource Center, to provide you with an historical overview via personal testimonies and personal recollections of the first two formative decades of the women's spirituality movement. So we're inviting you to join us with these taped interviews, with more interviews and resources to be added as time goes on. Our interview today with Max Dashu is taking place in 2018. I'm going to read Max's biography. Max Dashu has been a land witch all her life, a feminist, history sibyl, and artist as well. Her book, Witches and Pagans, Women in European Folk Traditions, from the year 1700 to 1000, printed by Vajra Press in 2016, has been acclaimed as a valuable resource for reconstructing ancestral European heritages. And she'll explain to us later why that is so important. It is part of the 15-volume series, Secret History of the Witches. Volume 2 will be Pythias, Melissae, and how do I say this, Max?
Pharmakides.
Say it?
Pharmakides.
All right. We really get an education when we talk to you. And it's on the women's spiritual cultures in Greece and the Aegean. That'll be in 2018, this year. Theosophy, Coloring Book of Goddesses, another book of hers. Spirits, Ancestors. It's a fabulous coloring book and so educational. And that came out in 2017. That features 50 icons from around the world with Max's drawings and commentary. In 1970, Dashu founded the Suppressed Histories Archives to research women's history and cultural heritage across the full spectrum of the world's peoples. She has built a massive collection of images and created 130 slideshows on female cultural heritages, including indigenous history. Her legendary slideshows bring to light female realities, usually hidden from view, from the ancient female figurines to women leaders, priestesses, clan mothers, philosophers, warriors and rebels, all with attention to patterns of conquest and domination. Dashu has been presenting her visual talks for 45 years, now internationally. She also teaches via webcast and online courses. Her daily posts on the Suppressed Histories Facebook page are followed by 164,000 people, and I'm one of them. Welcome, Max. Great to have you. Okay. This is a long, long body of work you've done and extremely unique. I mean, it is unique and it is singular and just a vast treasure. I personally have gained so much from it.
Thank you.
Thousands and thousands of women have. I thank you for this. I want to ask you, what were the first glimmerings of what we're calling women's spirituality or the goddess, women's heritage, spiritual heritage? When did you first get that glimmer?
Well, I was doing it before I named it. And so, as a teenager, I found my wisdom and my recalibration, my reorientation, my renewal in nature. So that's why I call myself a land witch. So that's my foundation. But when I dropped out of college in 1969 to research global women's history, very, very, right from the very beginning, I wanted to know where the women were, in the cultural record. And so what I came across first was the ancient female figurines. And I was looking for matricultural societies, and this is one of the things I found in the archaeological record, that these icons, these female icons in clay, stone, bone, ivory, whatever it may be, were something that existed over the whole world, that are just an integral part of the archaeological record. And the further back in time you go, the more you found them. So that to me was very significant, because my initial starting point was to look for where on the planet are women free, where have women had social power, spheres of honor and authority within cultures. And I was finding these images. And so that very quickly pointed me toward the sacral, that there was a way in which women and the female were foregrounded in pre-patriarchal cultures in a way that they aren't. A very different iconography, a very different way of envisioning what is female than what we're used to with mass media pornified culture. And with all the cultural spells of domination, when you look back, the movies, and the men spanking the women in the movies, and all of these scripts of domination, that was something I could see a real contrast in the way these images looked, the embodied spiritual grounding that they showed. That was not about pleasing men. It was not about performing femininity. It was about presence. It was about essence present in the body, in the psyche, that integration of spirit and soul and body. And so that made a really deep impression on me, and I kept looking for those images. And so that was one part of the starting point. And the second part was, as I was looking for in historical records for women who are honored by their societies, who are regarded as leaders, who have social authority, influence, and who are commemorated as well. There again, I found a really strong predominance of spiritual women. Priestesses, medicine women, female shamans, oracles like the Pythia at Delphi. And so this became a really important part of my research, because it really combined my interest in the spiritual realms and in spiritual journey and transformation and how that comes about with my search for societies in which women were not colonized, were not dominated structurally, culturally, and otherwise. And so I saw that these things went together. And so I began looking more and more into witches. That was an important part of the research that I was already doing in the early 70s, was out of my own ancestral heritage to find out what happened in Europe. The witch hunts, and what the witch hunts accomplished in that process of bringing women under systemic domination to a point where it was not even necessary to use violence anymore to bring a woman into line, but that it would be encoded culturally at such deep levels that it would be part of our socialization. And so, to me, our ability to free ourselves, it is a spiritual path. And I see politics and spirituality as deeply intertwined. You can see that same thing going on with the decolonization movement among original peoples, that they very much see the political nature of culture, the culture of domination, the settler culture that's over them, and also the political nature of the resistance and the importance of renewing those ancient spiritual ways, those ancestral ways. And so it's all integrated.
Yeah. Yeah. Way back in 1971, before, I think isn't that before you started collecting images, you had experiences with women camping out in nature, discovering yourselves through dance and song. Can you give us a picture of that? Because, you know, none of this, this was not a movement when you started. This was something that was coming up from inside so many women in different places. I'd like to hear what that was like.
In Buddhism, they would call it independent arising, independent co-arising, you know, that things were, it was a moment where this was happening, because there was this imperative, there was this spiritual imperative of, okay, there's all these structures around us, and we know very well how they work against us, but how do we get out of them? How do we get out of our own emotional conditioning? You know, the inhibitions that are embedded into us by culture and socialization. And so this is why for us it was really important to be on land, away from the man-made. The man-made world is it's just infused with energetic fields that, you know, trigger us in all kinds of ways. And being in nature allows you to pour that off. You know, there's the process of release where you become sane again. You know, you become grounded in true reality, not the man-made reality. And so that was really important for our healing, psychic healing, you know, for our ability to rediscover our bodies, to discover movement in our bodies that as an expression of our beings, instead of something that was conditioned in so many ways to perform, you know, that what I call the external gaze. And this is something I still see with women's dance, is that fear of the external gaze has women inhibiting unconsciously in really deep ways before we're even out of the gate, you know. And so trance dance was what we were doing at that time. We were living in a tent by a stream, squatting on some hippie land in the back 40 of that land, and drinking the water out of the stream and cooking over an open fire. We didn't have any equipment, just pots in that fire, gathering our own wood. And we would have the moon coming up, and we would be dancing to the moon. And, you know, there was not even cassette recorders in those days. You know, we had no music to bring with us. We didn't have any equipment. We were just us there on the land. That was it. And we were doing it. It was rocking our world, to just be there and to be with each other and to be affirming each other, you know, affirming our own intention to say, okay, we want out. We want to throw all of this off, and we want to really become who we are in our true nature. And so that was a moment. And then, of course, we had to get off the land because it started to rain. It was September in Vermont, and it was time to get the hell out of there because everything was getting moldy and our tent was leaking and it was too cold. And so back to the city we went, you know, because I mean, one of the many obstacles to creating temples and women's spirituality spaces is that women don't have land. You know, women as a community don't control land. And, you know, there's been a few places where that has broken through, but that continues to be an issue because everything in this society you have to pay to get. And so, you know, we're still struggling with that.
Yeah. Yeah. It's amazing. Well, it's not amazing. It's very natural how many women in this series of interviews have spoken about how important nature is and how as a child they were connected and how that came through into their adulthood. Nature as being the great teacher and purifier, as you said. Yeah.
Yes, and she's the fount.
Yeah.
She's the fount of wisdom. She is the fount of transformation. She is us. We are her. And it's just like, I feel like the practice of reattunement, you know, nature is the place to do that. I mean, you can do it other places. You can do it in your home, trance dancing, you know, in your own space. You can do it with groups of women in a temple or wherever, a rented hall. But nature is the fastest way there. You know, it is the source.
Well, and
She
it's
is the
where
source.
the original spirituality arises from, isn't it? It's like a connection with the cycles and the seasons and life, death, and renewal. But I want to bounce back to, how did you find each other? How did you women find each other to go out there camping together?
Yeah. Well, we were part of the radical feminist movement that arose at that time in 1970, 1971. And so we were political feminists, you know, and there was an issue there because a lot of people were not into the spiritual component of it. You know, there was a big split there between Marxist feminists and radical feminists. And then among radical feminists, there were those who were really, it was just only about politics and they didn't want any of this woo stuff, you know. So, you know, I think we went a long way. I mean, Starhawk was somebody who really was a prominent figure who was really articulating the way that the spiritual and the political go together. You know, and many of us were saying it, but she said it very well, you know, and exemplified it also in the way that she's lived. So that's that's an important piece, I think.
Yeah, yeah. That this, you really paint a picture here, how women's spirituality arose out of the second wave of women's liberation, out of the political, and how inseparable they really are.
Right.
Uh,
And then there was this burgeoning movement, and for me it happened in the lesbian witch underground, which in the early 70s you have the lesbian feminist movement is coming on really strong, and women are living in co-housing, basically lesbian collectives, lesbian households in different places. I mean, I was on the West Coast. There was a lot of us in the East Bay of San Francisco area, other places as well. And so this was happening everywhere. And women were finding, I mean, even those who didn't consider themselves spiritual feminists were finding ways culturally to express this explosion of liberation, women's liberation that was exploding all over the place. And there were, through culture, you know, so there was music, there was dance, there were poetry readings. I mean, Judy Grahn and the poetry readings on hers were very much full of women's spiritual insights, you know, so that was all happening. And so gradually, you know, all these points begin to form webs. And by the later part of the 70s, you have the women's land movement, because land was an important part of this. And many women felt, how are we ever going to heal from the violations that so many have suffered? And how are we ever going to get ourselves free if we can't get apart and have room to speak truth to each other and to create other structures? And of course that's very challenging, because you're basically trying to decolonize all of Western civ patriarchy, you know, and so it's fraught with problems. But you know, that happened, and women's singing circles and a lot of music arose out of that, and lots of covens, lots of witch groups that came about. There was just a lot of things blossoming in that period.
yeah, yeah. Um, what? When did you talked about starting to find images? Um, how did you first come across those first images that inspired you, and what were they?
Before I left college,
Uh-huh.
I was still in college. You have to understand, there was no women's studies at this time, 1969. There were no women's studies departments. Women's history was literally a joke. I'm dealing with anthropology professors who are saying, well, women have always been dominated by men throughout all of history, and even matrilineal societies are male-dominated societies. And so this is what started me out. I'm like, matrilineal societies, I want to know about those, because I knew there was something there. And, you know, the problem was how to find them, because at that point with card catalogs, it was very, very difficult to track this information. Nobody had really aggregated it together. I mean, you could find Bachhofen, a few books that even talked about this, mostly in the context of Greco-Roman civilization, like Bachhofen. But really, there was nothing that existed at that time that really looked through the framework of living indigenous societies, or to really aggregate all of the historical information that is in fact out there, should you dig deeply enough to find it, about societies which are egalitarian and structured around mother right. So that was my initial point of entry. And I thought, okay, where am I going to find these societies? So I am reading the anthropological literature, which was, not tremendously helpful in 1970. You find some articles, but not really, not very quality information, let's put it that way. And so what I did instead was I went about just ransacking archaeological studies from all over the world. And I was reading about Mohenjo-Daro in the Indus Valley, and I was reading about the plateau societies in ancient Mexico. And I was just going through ancient Mesopotamia and Egypt and what was in China, and looking for imagery, just it would show some different kind of cultural pattern than male domination. And so what I was finding, what was coming up over and over again, were these female figurines. And they were almost absent from anything that you could access at that time if you didn't go through the specialized literature of archaeological studies and know where to look in those. You weren't going to find this. You weren't going to find this imagery. You weren't going to find a discussion of it. When you did find the imagery, you would see, it wouldn't even necessarily bother to say where it was from or what time period it was. And it would often say fertility idol or dancing girl, or really stereotyped terminology being labeled onto them. And there was no indication that this had any social significance other than a pornified interpretation that said, well, women are sex objects, and so that's what these are for, is if they're cupping their breasts or if the vulva is highlighted, then that means these are sex idols, and they have to do with, again, male colonization of the female body. But I could see from looking at them that they weren't that, because they were really just not in line with the pornified culture. They were sovereign females. They were broad-bodied. They were present. They were self-possessed, self-contained. And so they had a very different flavor to them. So this was one of the primary areas that I researched, is I just went about trying to document where did these female figurines, or what I call now female icons, right, less of a diminutive term, where on the planet could they be found? And just really assemble a body of evidence for this, because really they are the central iconography of the Paleolithic and of the Neolithic in most parts of the world. Now, they don't exist everywhere, so there are parts of the world where you won't find them. Like, I haven't really seen really old examples from Australia, but some of the rainforest areas, like in Congo, where clay is maybe not being fired in those early periods, it's not an absolute what I'm proposing here, but I'm saying that once you see it on every, in South America, North America, Central America, Europe, Africa, and Asia, then that's a very strong pattern. And so then we have to look at this, and we have to look at the context of it in order to say, well, how do we interpret these? What do they mean? What do they say about women? What do they say about the society that they occur in, that they were made by, and how that society regarded women? And one of the things I've come to about it is that they represent, at least one aspect of them, a record of ceremonial culture. The making of these figures, the symbolism encoded into them, many times they're body painted, or they may have representations of tattoos on the women's bodies. The women are gesturing to their breasts or to their center or to their vulva. There's a whole range of symbolic gestures, of sacred signs that are actually inscribed on the bodies of these ancient figurines. We cannot any longer see the women themselves doing ceremony, but we get some idea of what that ceremony might have been looking like by seeing the figurines. What the Australians call painting up for ceremony, where you are taking substances like red ochre being primordial symbol of Earth's lifeblood. So it's not just a symbol of that, it is the life essence of Mother Earth that represents also our blood. And they are painting that in sacred signs on their body. So that's ceremony. And we don't know a lot about what that ceremony looked like, but we can see a reflection of it in the figurines. And that would also go for the ceremonial vessels that are painted with spirals that are many times have breasts molded onto them. So you have libation vessels that were used in ritual representing women's breasts. So basically we can see there that they're honoring life givers. This symbol of milk, of the breast that gives milk and that gives life, as being the ceremonial is somehow organized around that principle of the life givers. And so that's important. And sometimes on these ancient clay vessels that were made by women in the Neolithic, painted by women, we will actually see scenes of women doing ceremony, especially sacred dance. So you have lines of women in ancient Iraq and Iran who are dancing together. And sometimes they're holding objects in their hands. Lines of women also in Pakistan in the ancient Indus Valley, same representation. You see it in China, you see it in archaic Greece as recently as 27 centuries ago. And there's other places where these representations occur. So Egypt, that's a testimony directly from ancestors about what their spiritual ways look like, because they're actually painting it for us. We're seeing groups of women. In Egypt, they're holding ceremonial fans in their hands. And the fan is still very important in the rituals of Oshun in the Yoruba tradition. We can see things in the archaeology that actually we can connect to present day religious practices in living traditions.
That is just a phenomenal insight into how to wake up from the cultural trance and how you did it, and how you, I feel that if someone sees this interview, they can never look at images in quite the same way, because they all are encoded with something, just as you've said. And I think that I want to go back to the fact that I want to highlight the fact that the women's spirituality movement has a lot to owe to the lesbians and lesbian community, the lesbian consciousness that really didn't need the approval of men, and how you gathered together and felt what it really was to be women, and what that means, and how that's totally not pornographic. And so you could interpret, and any woman can, if she just feels herself, can interpret what those gestures mean at the real natural level. Like you said, the breasts are sacred, the vulva is sacred, life comes from there. So I find it just, I've seen so many of your images. When I want to encourage people to take your webinars, get your books, your book coming out, get your coloring book, because when you're saturated with these images, your consciousness changes, doesn't it?
There's an absolute shift that happens because these are things we have not been shown. There are gatekeeping functions built into the culture, at the level of what is written, what the editors do, what the publishers choose, the pictures they put on the covers, the books they choose to publish, the books they reject, and that's just on the level of print. Media is even worse. The level of gatekeepers in what it takes to make a movie is just tremendous. And you're talking about huge budgets, and you're talking about, many levels of male gatekeepers, basically, forming how youth are envisioning women and men. And all our bodies are sacred, but it's women's bodies that have been colonized. It's women who have been constrained in very severe ways in order to uphold a patrilineal system, to uphold male domination. And so this is medicine for us to see these other kinds of images.
Yeah. I remember early on looking at Maria Gambudis' books, Language of a Goddess, and just how poring over the images there, before I discovered your work, poring over the images there goes into a level that it imprints at a real fundamental level, and deprograms us. You had an early experience with a film, Woman to Woman. Was that the name of the film? That kind of split your work on? Would you tell us about that?
Yeah, because that's really how I got into teaching with images, was that I was asked to become a historical consultant, all volunteer, of course. This is the women's movement in the early 70s. There's no money. But there was a student at UCLA Film School who was making one of the first feminist documentaries, and it was called Woman to Woman. And her name is Donna Dietz. She did Desert Hearts, in fact, the film of the Jane Rule lesbian novel. But anyhow, I went down to Southern California, and we went around gathering images that we were going to film. And there was going to be a segment in the documentary, maybe 10 or 15 minutes, on women's history, because she felt like that was an important component of what we needed to do in the women's movement. And so we went to USC, we went to UCLA, we were going through the library. There was a group of maybe 3 or 4 of us. And, I'm just pulling books off the shelf, and we're looking through them, and we're looking for images of female power, in archaeology, in art history, in the cultural record. And so those became the first slides. We took slides of them, and she was going to film the slides. And then that never happened. That part of the movie, to my knowledge, was ever, whatever existed of it that she did. And most of the slides died in a studio fire that she had. But luckily, she sent me duplicates of about 320 slides that we had taken together. I learned how to use a copy stand. I was not oriented towards photography. I would have never done this on my own, but the fates put me in her path. Judy Grahn actually was a conduit through which this connection happened. And Cynthia Fitzpatrick, who was a musician in the women's funk band High Risk in Los Angeles. And so it came about. And for me, it was I was already looking for this information. So I had some idea of how to look. But of course, I hadn't gotten into the UCLA library and been able to look through their collections. And so we're finding the Jomon figurines from ancient Japan, which is like a massive, the whole archaeological record of Neolithic Japan is centered on women, and these are stompers. These are not your delicate wilting violet images of females. These are strong, broad-bodied women with spirals engraved on their bodies, and their shoulders squared, and eyes that are like sometimes really huge, and just really powerful iconography. And so many things that we found there. And so that was my starting point. After that, I got a hold of a camera and a copy stand, and I started taking the pictures myself, just doing it on my own. And at that time, I never said, oh, I'm going to start an archive, and it's going to have 50,000 images in it, and, all of this. I just thought, well, there's a certain amount to be found, and I will put it out there. And, I just didn't have enough light on my path to see that far ahead. But that is what happened, because as I gathered, then it became evident there was more, and I needed to broaden my search. It wasn't, I was never just looking for female figurines. I was always looking for female shamans. I was looking for mother rights societies. But I realized, okay, I also need to document patriarchy and all systems of domination. And so this has also been a focus of my work, is to talk about racial caste, colonization of indigenous peoples, and all of that, because I see this all as very much intertwined. The codes of domination are deeply entwined amongst each other. And so that was why originally I was calling the project Matriarchives, because that was my starting point. I wanted to find societies where women were free. And so I actually changed the name to the Suppressed Histories Archives to show that it wasn't only about these dominance-free societies, but it was also about the historical process that created patriarchy and racism and settler colonialism. And so now it's the Suppressed Histories Archives, and it has been for 42 years.
Mm-hmm.
But starting in 1969, so I'm at this now. In November, it will be 49 years. I started when I had just turned 19.
Wow. That's it's stunning. It's just stunning what you've done. And it's a collection that is completely singular. There's nothing like it. And you're still finding images, aren't you? You're still trying to keep up with yourself.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. I mean, I'm finding things that were impossible to find in 1971. I'm finding things that were impossible to find in 1989, because, now we have the internet, and I'm finding things on Google Image that I could never find in books because nobody ever bothered to print color pictures of them. Or, it's just like some of it is you have to learn where to look, and it's like I spent a lot of time trying to figure out, okay, where are these matricultural societies on the planet? Where do I look? And in order to figure that out, basically, I was looking at indigenous societies from the get-go.
Mm-hmm.
My reasoning being that these are cultures that are not hierarchical in the main. There are exceptions, but I thought that would correlate with a society that did not have a sex hierarchy, and that proved out pretty well. So it's just all a process of uncovering, and there are things being published every year that are, more detailed studies, not just the global overviews, but detailed studies of what matricultural society looks like in Tanzania, or in Sumatra, or in Colombia, And so these are all countries, not coincidentally, which are not on the cultural radar as we were shown. Nobody taught us about Ecuador when I was growing up. In fact, growing up in Illinois, nobody taught us about ancient Illinois or the native peoples that were there, in my very own native land. There was nothing about ancient medieval Great Lakes peoples, or the Mississippian cultures and the fabulous archaeology that exists. So it's all there to be uncovered and to be decolonized.
Yeah. So in The Secret History of the Witches, that is the 17 volume, right? That is the focus of your 17 volume coming up. Tell us why that is so important, tracking that particular vein.
Right. Okay. Well, first of all, what happened in Europe? That the series is about what happened in Europe, and especially with putting women at the center. What does European history look like if we see what happened to women? And so it begins with the megalithic cultures, and that's probably going to be the last volume that I write, because there's more research I need to do on that. But going through the megalithic cultures, and then the ancient history as it was presented to us. So you've got the Greeks. This is the current volume I'm working on. You've got the Romans. Then you have feudal Europe. Let's not skip over the process of Christianization and feudal Christianity, church and state. And in those times, what you see happening is that even in the patriarchal societies that existed before the Greco-Roman world, or the Celtic or the Germanic for that matter, they are patriarchal societies to one degree or another, but they still have female spheres of power. With the coming of this church-state alliance, you see a concerted attempt to push women out of the spiritual sphere of authority altogether. So religion becomes another deeper level of colonizing women. Now it's not just colonizing her by you bash her over the head and you drag her off, or the husband beats his wife and everybody looks on complacently, but really an internal colonization is starting to happen, led by church and state, both the secular laws and the canon law, that is telling women to police themselves from the inside. God wants you to look down and submit to man. God wants you to submit. This is your chosen role. You're an inferior sex. You are the daughter of Eve. You're to blame. Everything is women's fault. And so women start to internalize this guilt and shame that is just spewed at them from every direction of the culture. So that's an important moment. That's another whole layer. And that's, as if that's not bad enough, then you have the process of the witch hunts, which begins in the feudal period, and then it increases in the later Middle Ages, and then on into the Renaissance. And so I'm tracking the way the witch hunts happened. It's important for us to know the dynamics of how this took place, because it's still going on under different names, by different means. And so, the torture trials, what the torture trials did to European culture, I call it the prehistory of the religious right, or of Western civ, that you can see the use of coercion, the use of scapegoating, of name-calling, of a shunning and banning, and then finally physical attacks on women, who then are persecuted and become the humans on whom the entire frustration of the society is vented. So in the period of the plague, and then later on in the period of the enclosures, where people are being driven off their lands and the unity of the peasant communities is being demolished. This is the period where the mass hunts gather steam. And the use of torture that was reintroduced, a lot of people don't know this, but Greek and Roman societies both had judicial torture. It was actually mandated. They would torture a person's slaves. Both the accused and the accuser, their slaves, could be tortured in order to get testimony that would be used in the trial. And so in about the 1100s, the church doctors went back, and there was a period where they were starting to read the classics again, and they saw all this, and they reinstituted this through the Inquisition, which was founded in the early 1200s. And so the Inquisition then, very quickly, within 100 years, has really been turned over to the process of witch hunting. They stamped out the Cathars and looked around and said, okay, who's next? And so it was in that torture trial setting that a lot of the mythology of the demonologists begins to enter European culture, including the sexualization of torture, including the racist demonologies, the idea of blackness as demonic. Even the myth of the black rapist can be traced back to the fantasies of these demonologists that women were forced to parrot in order to make the torture stop. And so that's that story. And when I get up to the 1400s, then I start adding in to the whole history of European patriarchy and class system, also the history of European empire and colonization of the rest of the world, and the way that the witch hunt ideologies, the demonology, the racist diabolism, was ready-made as an ideology of conquest against the rest of the world. And it was exported by Europe to Africa, to the Americas, to the Philippines, to the whole rest of the planet, the Pacific Islands. So that's why I chose, even though this is really, obviously, from what I've said, this is really unpleasant material, a lot of it. And I've only been talking about the bad part. The other part is I'm really documenting the authentic cultural ways, which we can talk about. But it's very important for us to understand these things, because what happens with these cultural spells and these toxins is, unless they are metabolized, unless they're digested and seen clearly, full bore, then they continue. And we saw a really dramatic way that happened in the resurrection of anti-Semitism under Hitler. A lot of the memes, including Jew burning, were committed during the Middle Ages and during the Spanish Inquisition. So they come back. And we've seen that also happening now under Trumpism and the resurrection. I mean, it never went away, but there is this resurgence of racism and of misogyny that's going on. And again, because society has not really grappled with these things. In the case of the women's movement, a lot of women decided, okay, I think the problem's solved now. I can now be a lawyer. I can now do whatever, I'm all right until she's running for her life from a batterer, or is dramatically raped or something like that. Then a lot of women say, oh, it's okay, it's solved, we're good now, it's okay, until it hits them, and then they realize, wow, it's still here. So in the meantime, this is all really fueling the backlash that's going on.
Well, Max, that just brings us right back to spirituality and politics. And, this whole takeover, this whole colonization took place because the men kicked the women out. The church became the political power, as we know, in Europe. And so that became the political power and wiped out the natural spirituality, the female honoring, earth honoring spirituality, which is why the women's spirituality movement is so important. They are inseparable. You cannot demolish spirituality without taking over politically. And
they did that demolishing systematically. One of the sources, I want to talk a little bit, because I don't want to give the impression that the secret history of the witches is all direness. I mean, we have to tell those stories about the oppression and the way that its legacies persist in our culture today. But the other side of it, and this is at least as much as important in all the stories that I'm telling in all those books, is to reconstruct as best we can what were those authentic spiritual ways? What of each of the ethnicities? And we've got the Lithuanians and the Italians and the Germanic peoples, the Norse, the Celtic peoples, Spain, Romania, the Balkans, the Slavic world. Each of those places have really precious cultural treasures, and it is a ripped web of culture, because church and state got in there and tried their best to stamp it out, burn it out. And yet, people loved this culture. They used it for healing. It was something they had from their grandmothers. And so even though they may have submitted to the church and, they do Christian prayers and things, they're still maybe measuring somebody with a cord as part of their healing ceremony. The charms may have had the pagan deities' names pushed out of them, and now they're calling on saints, or they're calling on Mother Mary, but they're still doing it, or they continue doing these things, and the use of water and fire and stone in healing. All of this, that's the treasure that's embedded in what in this 16 volumes is to reconstruct what did we look like before all this happened. What were the spiritual ways like? And that is where you begin to discover what Europe has in common with everybody else on the planet, all the other cultures, is that, you find the sacred dance, you find the use of smudging, the medicine ways. In fact, even things like the names that witches were called in the original languages. In Anglo-Saxon, there's this great word, libestre, which literally means medicine woman. And it's the root word lib is related to the word for life. It is used as a word for magical herbs and healing herbs in Norse. It's used in Anglo-Saxon for amulet. There's all these connections of it beyond just the meaning of medicine. So those are what I consider the cultural treasures that we can recover and that we need to know, especially those of us who are of European descent. We need authentic ground to stand on. You know, we need to understand our roots because we can't just go borrowing from everyone else, especially not Native peoples whose ways have been appropriated and suppressed and persecuted for so long. They are the authentic keepers of those ways, and we need to have our own. And I think that's been a big part of what women's spirituality has attempted to do. I mean, you have a multi-ethnic spectrum of women who are all trying to do that in different ways,
Yeah.
you know. And so if you look, for example, at Mitchfest, which was one of the premier organs of the women's movement, of the lesbian movement, of the women's spirituality movement, you had the women of color tent doing workshops that were by and for Native women, by and for African American women. There are drum groups, you know, so many different cultural blossomings have come forth out of all the different ethnicities of women's liberation. And so amazing things have been created out of that, amazing bodies of cultural production and spiritual insight. You know, I think of Farron's song Testimony or Misty Mountain. You know, that's feminist spirituality.
Yeah.
And there's so much of it.
You bring through when you're talking about the positive aspects, you know, what in European tradition, European world, the things that connect us to, in other words, you give us the lens to the clues, the way you followed your clues. You give us the lens to view, for instance, you talk about what's it called, the spindle, it starts with a D. It's in your book, Secret of the Witches. The distaff, of course. And its significance in mythology and in women's ways and in you know, actual folk ways, daily life. And once we get that lens going that you're giving us, then we start to see everything around us it's really close. It's closer than we think. The natural spirituality is closer than we think. It's been just, you know, covered over, but it's all there. And you really bring it to light. Yeah.
That's something that really Native women's culture has had right along, you know, is that when you make pottery, gathering the clay, like the Navajo go and they talk to the clay mother and they pray to her and they make an offering to her before they start digging clay out of the earth, and they're singing to her, and then they bring the clay back, and there's like a whole ceremony around the process so that when the pot finally exists, it's been made and fired and painted, the pot is filled with prayers. There's a complete integration of the spiritual and the technological and the economic, because these pots are used in gathering water, in cooking, and storing food, so that there's this very technological and economic aspect of daily life that's there, but it's not divorced from the spiritual. The spiritual is very much together with that. And I think that this is something that we once had also in European culture, but it was really excised with a lot of violence, you know,
Yeah.
to get women to stop doing things those ways.
Yeah. Well, your work could never be more timely than, as you said, with this revivification of racism under this Trump administration, and then the ways that Hitler, you know, revived the Jew burning, all of these themes, all of these approaches to colonization and demonizing others, and how it relates to our fundamental human spirituality.
Yeah, and they really demonize those spiritual ways. One of my favorite finds that I use in Witches and Pagans, the volume 7 out of my series, Secret History of the Witches, is from a penitential book. And the penitential books were when the bishops went chasing after people that that carried out pagan customs and tried to stamp them out. And so they wrote manuals for each other to interrogate people. And, is there any woman who does this? And is there anyone who does that? And so there's this one line. It was a penitential that was written in France in Latin in the 800s. And so this is pretty much par for the course. It's talking about how people go to springs and wells and stones and trees, and how this is forbidden and they should not go to those places to pray or make offerings. That basic theme is found in almost all of the canon law of this period, all of the penitential books. That's because this is the core. This is the core of the nature spirituality of heathen Europeans at that time. But what I love is that an Anglo-Saxon scribe translated this into his language 1,000 years ago. So this is Paleo English, right? And he adds one clause to this. And so the text condemns those who go to earthbound stone or to trees or to wells. And then he adds, Swa Wiccan Tacheth, ask the witches teach. And so that one line is showing us that in that time period, nobody's talking, the priests are talking about devils, but it's showing us that the witches themselves are regarded, A, as spiritual teachers, B, as nature spirituality practitioners, and C, that people are regarding, that they are teaching people to do their spiritual life in a nature-based context. That you're going to go. And the earthbound stone is really interesting because maybe it's just a sacred rock in the ground, and maybe it actually is a megalithic monument. And, we don't really know that. But the idea of going and sitting by the waters, so many of us have found that as a healing thing to do. You sit near a river or the ocean or a pond and you gaze at the movement of power through the water, the rippling of wind on the water, the reflection of sunlight or moonlight, and it puts us at ease, and we drop our pain. We're able to release through this. Water is life, as everyone is saying now, following the Dakota teachings and the Anishinaabe and all the other native teachings. Essie Parrish, the Pomo dreamer in California, in about 75 years ago, was talking about how water was at the root of her way of doctoring. And she says, water is creation. Water is how I heal, and so she spoke about this in a film that she made about her ways, her healing ways in the roundhouse, the Kashaya roundhouse in California during the 1940s and 1950s. And she recorded herself with the doctoring plants in the native language. And the people are there with the elder clapping sticks, singing with her while she shamanizes and doctors a sick man. So she preserved that for us.
Wonderful. You've spoken about sacred dance. Did you want to say anything more about it? Because I know you're very focused on that right now.
Well, I've always been focused on it. That's really a big part of my spiritual practice. Dance and incantation is transformative. It is a way that we integrate ourselves.
I'm not hearing you very well.
I have to lean forward.
Okay.
Dance and incantation is a way of integration. It's healing, it's release, it's self-transformation. It is a way to recover our deepest nature, and to throw off all of the layers and all of the poisons that accumulate, all of the wounds, overcome those traumas. When I was doing trance dance, I was living, I did a retreat for about 1.5 years in the mid-'70s because, politics is hard, and even the lesbian feminist community became very hard, and there were lots of battles. We're embattled community. And so I decided, okay, time to go to ground, go to the land. And so I rented a house in the foothills of the Cascades in Washington, and I was just really walking the land, which is the other part of my spiritual practice, to walk the land and to chant the land. And I was doing trance dance all alone in this house, playing music of Miriam Makeba or whatever rang my bell, Hungarian music, or just things to just taste the world, taste the truth through music and through movement. And when I was doing this dance, there were moments where I felt release happening. And sometimes there would be a certain part of my body that would release, and I would have like a painful memory that would come up and that would go. There's this way in which, by doing these things which are not based in thought, they're not based in analysis, they are about a more direct experience in your consciousness, through body, through movement, through sound, through resonance, pounding on the chest, pounding on the thighs, creating percussion, just like all of these rhythms and sounds bring you into an awareness that we're not normally functioning out of. Realized beings are functioning out of it, but we're not. It's very difficult to sustain that consciousness, and so I feel like it's constantly having to be a process of return. You have to go back. You have to get back to it. And so that's what ecstatic dance is for me. And that was very early on when I was, the other part of my studies in the 70s was I was looking for, okay, what is witchcraft? Who were the witches really? What were their practices really about? I very quickly came across studies of shamanism. So I was reading Mircea's very sexist classic Shamanism, the book Shamanism. And, it was really biased against women in very profound ways, but it was also a really great learning experience because he was describing cultural worlds that I hadn't been able to taste before. And so he was talking a lot about North Asia, the Siberians. And, that got me going on a whole thing. Through that whole period of the mid-70s, I was reading everything I could on Central Asia, North Asia, the native societies in that part of the world, their ecstatic ceremonies, and, just learning a lot about it. So that was an important piece. And of course, we have to decolonize shamanism too, because in the interim since that time, there was this whole New Age appropriation of shamanism, which became basically a marketing, branding terminology. People were using it to sell really expensive workshops, and and so there was native pushback against the way that happened, against the appropriation of Lakota sweat lodges and many other things. And this is an issue we have to deal with within women's spirituality as well, is that issue of appropriation, which is one reason why I really feel strongly that recovery of ancestral ways is so important, because we have to be able to find our root. The truth is at our root. And when you come to your root, then you can encounter others from other cultural directions, in a way that's respectful and whole, without trying to glom on and rip off, And that's an issue that's still around, that we're still having to grapple with. And this is what they told some of the well-meaning white folks that went to Sacred Stone Camp and the Seven Fires Camp in Dakota for the Water is Life the pipeline protests that happened.
Yeah,
is the elders were saying, don't try to be Lakota, don't try to be Dakota. Go back and find your ancestral European ways. And, this is something that a lot of us have been trying to do for decades, but I think that there's a new recognition that this is what has to happen, in order not to behave in the historic colonizing way.
it really addresses in a very direct way right-wing Christianity, because the European spirituality, the indigenous ways of Europe precede, of course, Christianization and all that codification, and which, of course, was part of the demonization and was necessary part of the demonization and colonization, is to have that spiritual stamping down and that political power by the church and that codification of spirituality and the erasure of women, and the folks ways. So it given it's I'm just thinking in terms of how this would impact Christians today, especially right-wing Christians. They don't know their own history, and as this resurgence of racism and xenophobia that we're having in the United States under the Trump administration, this is just in direct relationship to that. So the work that you're doing is so pointed towards what needs to happen, Max. And you know that, and I'm just voicing it and thanking you for it.
Could I just say in relation to that one of the things that's going on is that the right-wing Christians are making Muslims the poster child for patriarchy. And they're projecting all of the patriarchy is over there with Muslims, them, they, the other. Okay, and this is a pattern that's old too, because the Crusades. Okay, I mean George Bush invoked the Crusades even before Trump in the invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq. You know, and so this was a resurrection of an old cultural toxin. But now what we're seeing even more is that Muslims have been made to symbolize male domination. And so there's this shadow projection by Christians who, you know, I've seen this happen on the Suppress Histories page on Facebook, is I will post something about, you know, something some Pope did or whatever, you know, something about a Christian patriarchy, the history of Christian patriarchy. And they will turn around right away and say, but what about the Muslims? What about this? What about the veil? And it's like, okay, look, you know, you cannot deflect everything back over there, because you have to deal with what's right in front of your nose. This is really what's happening here, you know, and you don't get to redirect it in that way. You don't get to make another cultural group be the symbolic poster child for patriarchy. And I think that really at core what we're seeing here, and this is an integral characteristic of patriarchy, is that this is authoritarian culture. It's institutional authoritarianism. It's totalitarian, in fact. You know, and you can find that in Muslim context, and Daesh and the extremists, you know, here in West Asia are a great example of that. You know, I'm certainly not defending them, but what we're seeing in the United States is, you know, law-abiding Muslim families are being set upon. You know, women are having veils ripped off their, you know, their scarf ripped off their head, or attacked in Target, screamed at, because this person just has decided that an entire group is evil. And this is part of that totalitarian impulse that's embedded in patriarchal culture, in racist culture, you know, and those to me are very much as we look at Western civ.
Yeah, very well said. What a perspective. I'd like to ask you if, as we come to the end time here, is there anything else that you would like to add? What would you like to say? What would you like to include? Open question.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, you know, what I would like to say is that I'm in a time now where it's like there's this amazing convergence happening, and I am getting ready to have streamable videos online. I mean, these resources that we've been talking about, I want them to be available, you know, digitally, you know, globally. And so the whole, I've been really struggling for years to just get all these pieces in place. You know, funding it, for one thing, has been a problem, but to get the equipment, to get the access that I need, the tech advice, the tech support, to be able to have all of these visual talks be streamable on demand. And so that's starting to come together now. I just launched a Patreon page where there are going to be links for some of that to happen. It's going to be available through the Suppressed Histories website. I'm going to also start audio podcasting because it's taking too long to write articles and books. And, I decided, well, the Secret History of the Witches, I got 15 chapters sitting in file drawers. And I feel a lot of urgency about this story being told, but it's going to take time to get these books out one by one, and it's very important to me that, they be accurate and that I have everything together in the right way. But I'm going to start talking about them on podcasts. And so that's going to be something also accessible through the Suppressed History site, through my blog, and through Patreon. So it's patreon.com/maxdashu, MAXDASHU. And I'm asking people for their support because nobody funds this. I'm an independent scholar. I have no degrees. Everybody tells me how important this is. And, it's really for a lack of a nail that the realm has not been lost, but been delayed for far too long. And I really want to start pouring out all of this information, all these images, so that everybody can taste them, because it is needed.
Yeah, it's very needed. And I think that that doing it verbally and as these audio streams before you can get the books published, the audio has its own value, the oral tradition, right? So it's going to be invaluable.
It's its own medium, and it's because it's sound and it's through time, and so people can stream it while they're doing the dishes or while they're driving or whatever. It's a different thing. But
and it's coming. And it's coming from you, Max. It's coming from your voice. There's a transmission that happens when it comes from the person who is carrying that knowledge. I know that from attending your webinars and going to live presentations by you. So it's just a real treasure that way, as well as the books will be a treasure. And the information to contact you, the Patreon account and Suppressed Histories Archives.net. This is all going to accompany the interview here in text. So if people didn't write it down, they'll be able to see it here wherever they find this video. There'll be text accompanying and giving those links to be able to access that and support you.
I really appreciate what you said about the oral tradition, because I think that's a really key point. I think that is one way that it's been difficult doing the work I do, because it has been an oral tradition and did not get seen, including by a lot of feminists, because it wasn't in book form. It didn't count for them.
Yeah.
And so, that's changed. But, I still feel like the oral tradition is a way that it's through personal contact, one way or the other. It has a one-on-one aspect to it, or a one-on group aspect, and I think that that's something very ancient. It predates literacy.
Yeah, and I love hearing your voice. I've got your some of your DVDs. I've got Woman and Shaman. Hearing your voice, explaining the images, hearing the words that I can't pronounce, like the early one today at the beginning of the interview.
Which is helpful, right?
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And I love the sound of these words, and you speak them in with the dialect, or that is close to the language itself, and you know how to pronounce them. And you started
my best shot.
Okay,
I take my best shot.
Hey, it fools me. So, and you started this way. You started very early on in the 70s. You did bookstores and the coffee houses, this sort of thing, giving your presentations. And that's how you found that women were hungry, really hungry for this. And they still are, and we still are, and we need it now more than ever. So,
what the interesting thing about that is, with the bookstores and the early shows that I did, and even more recent shows, is that invariably some woman would come up and ask, in the question period, would say, how did this happen? How did we get to be where we are? And it was like, those are the same questions that I had starting out. That's what I wanted to know.
Yeah.
But it brings that up because it is in the back of women's minds. And up till now, there's most of the time in the world, there's no way to talk about this. It's just not, it's not discussed.
Yeah.
And so as soon as it's up as a topic, then these questions start pouring out. You know,
Yeah.
how did things ever go this wrong?
Yeah. Well, you really give the picture, and you really give the picture of how to see the clues, what's all around us in our daily life, takes us back to the original spirituality. And you give us all the clues to the lens through which to see the suppression and the distortion. So it's all there. Any one final last words before we say goodbye to our viewers?
Overthrow domination, realize your original nature. Water is life. Revere the mothers. Blessings of earth.
Thank you. Thank you. We have been listening to Max Dashu. Thank you for joining us, everyone, and blessed be.
Thank you, Vajra.